Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, Senior Vice President of the Wilson Center. On behalf of former Congresswoman Jane Harman, the Center's President and CEO, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Wilson Center for today's 5th annual Swiss Day. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Ambassador Martin de Hinden, who has taken time out of his busy day to join us here in person from the Swiss Embassy. I would also like to extend a sincere welcome to Andreas Kellerhals, Director of the Europa Institute, co-host of today's event. Without the partnership of our good friends at the Europa Institute, Swiss Day would not be possible. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan public-private forum chartered by Congress to serve as the official memorial to our 28th president. We tackle global issues through independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas. We seek to provide safe political space for addressing key public policy issues, such as the one we'll discuss today. The Center is delighted to once again co-host this year's annual Swiss Day, which celebrates the continued and key collaboration between the Wilson Center and our Swiss partners, the Europa Institute at the University of Zurich and the Swiss Embassy. Over the years, the Wilson Center has benefited greatly from these partnerships. Through publications, scholarly research, and events, our joint efforts have grown. Each year, we welcome 2 Wilson Center Swiss scholars to Washington to be in residence here. These Swiss scholars contribute both in research and discussion to the Wilson Center's scholarship-driven community. We've had the distinct honor to have hosted 16 Swiss scholars at the Wilson Center in the last 5 years. Today's event, a conversation with Peter Maurer, the president of the International Red Cross, will focus on the future of war and challenges for humanitarians. Just some quick logistical information. Following today's event, there will be a reception in the memorial hallway downstairs on the ground level. All are welcome to join and continue today's discussion over a delicious reception. The format today is that it's my pleasure now to turn the floor over to Director Kellerhals for a word of introduction from our Swiss partner. And then Ambassador de Hinden, we'll follow him with brief remarks. Then we'll hear the keynote address by Peter Maurer, and then the President and I will have a brief discussion about some of the themes of his talks, and then over to you all for your comments and questions. So with that, Director Kellerhals, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, dear Mr. President Maurer, Mr. Litvak, Senior Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Ambassador de Hinden, ladies and gentlemen. This is every year a great day for us to be here in Washington to, in a way, celebrate the cooperation we have with the Woodrow Wilson Center. This is really something we are very proud of, and we look forward to many more years to come. It was said it's the 5th time that we can do that. We are able to send over here every year 2 scholars for 4 months. It's in a way all paid, and we were said at the beginning it's even including a secretary if they work here. I'm not sure whether this is really true, but it sounds very tempting. So I would like to thank our partners for this great cooperation, and we're looking forward, as I said, to many more Swiss days to come. From the beginning, the idea behind this lecture series was, among others, to bring Swiss-related issues on the agenda here in Washington, if only for a day or maybe even only for half a day or even an afternoon. The International Committee of the Red Cross indeed is something very Swiss-related. It is Swiss-created, it is based in Switzerland, it is run by a Swiss. It's, in a way, its symbol is based, if I'm not mistaken, on the Swiss national flag. And finally, the ICRC is something very close to the heart of all Swiss. And this for a very good reason, as we'll hear today. The ICRC is pursuing a very noble, important, and difficult task, and deserves all our support. I'm extremely grateful that President Maurer is here today to talk about his work. If I'm right, you have just returned from a field excursion to visit the Iraq, where very difficult living conditions are upon all the people living there. We might be interested also to learn about what you have seen in places like that. I hand now over the microphone to Martin Dahinter, the Swiss ambassador, who will address the audience after me. Please.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm always taking the floor at the Swiss Days, but this time it's a special time because my friend Peter Maurer is here among us and will share his thoughts. We started a long time ago as trainees in the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I wanted to tell this even so I know this is not the most outstanding feature in Peter Maurer's career. Peter Maurer is a person with a combination of qualities you not always find. He is somebody with a strong operational hand, but also an intellectual, a person who thinks a lot about what he is doing and what's going on. And then he is a very skilled historian and in the same time a person who looks to the future and is interested in what's about to happen and what will happen. We think the discussion we have now should get to a broader audience. This is the reason why we will also disseminating it through our Swiss Touch campaign. This is a campaign mainly based on social media, and there we had already had a series of events to similar topics: cybersecurity, cyber warfare, financial innovation in humanitarian affairs. So I'm very curious about what Peter Maurer will tell us. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Robert, Martin, Andreas, for the introduction, and to all of you for being here this afternoon. When I reflected on the title and I saw the subtitle, I was a little bit scared. The subtitle talks about keynote address. My understanding of a keynote address, that is something that lasting like a Fidel Castro speech at least for 5 hours. And when I saw that I have moved from being a humanitarian to being a foresighter on future conflicts, I was even more scared that maybe I venture into new territories. But okay, so I'm very relieved to know that this is an introduction to the discussion I'm happy to have afterwards with Robert. And I haven't gone into foresight, but of course we have developed over the last 155 years our own way in looking at conflicts, being active on and in conflicts. And I think I wanted to share some of our views on how we look at today's international environment and how it challenges us as humanitarians and what we eventually can extrapolate for what is still in the pipeline and still to come in the conflict environment in which we operate. No need in a public like here at the Wilson Center to go into details, but we live in an environment of rapid but uneven socioeconomic progress, of public governance failing at multiple levels for too many people. We know that roughly 2 billion people live in absolute poverty or below poverty lines, which is an issue of concern. We see new actors emerging on the political landscape, and in particular in the front line of conflicts, we see new actors emerging, most of them non-state actors. We see the physical and virtual worlds merging to create augmented realities, which again change the environment in which we operate. We see climate change, population growth, and urbanization pressuring more structurally society and compounding some of the short-term challenges with which we are confronted as humanitarian actors. With the technological achievements that have empowered people are also creating unprecedented infringements on their freedoms and fundamental rights. And we see a vast scale of need, a landscape of need developing, which concerns us. 65 million people displaced by war and violence, rapidly increasing mortality rates by children under 5 in the 20 largest conflict regions of the world in which we are active. And we see an increasing bill on the cost of conflict. Today, estimates, scientific estimates go to say that today's violence and conflict cost the economy $14 trillion a year, which is basically something between 12 and 15% of global GDP. During this year, I have visited quite many of the conflict regions in which we operate: Syria, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Central African Republic, just to mention a few of them. And in those regions, I spoke with families who lost their loved ones, and they had to change their entire way of life. They were most of the time exhausted, tired of bombs and rockets dropping on their neighborhoods, broken from not knowing the fate of missing or detained family members. Their suffering was acute, the result of wars spinning out of control, just as we have seen in other front lines like in Mosul, Sana'a, or Taiz in Yemen. The ICRC today works in 80 countries around the world where communities are suffering from the effects of armed conflict or violence. We provide humanitarian relief, protection, and assistance work in all those contexts. And we are bound by the basic principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement: neutrality, independence, impartiality, which inform the way we approach some of those conflicts. I wanted to mention to you 5 challenges and 3 approaches which hopefully offer some solutions for the future. Turning to the 5 challenges that we encounter in today's conflict environment, which may point also to the nearer and middle-term future, is first, the conflicts are increasingly protracted and they are more often fought in urban areas. Protracted means that they are increasingly long-term and complicated to resolve. Interesting may be for you to know that in the 10 largest operations of ICRC, our average presence is 36 years. Just to remind you that we have been founded as an organization for emergency short-term relief, and when we look at the bulk of our work, it's conflict regions in which we stay for 36 years. In a similar vein, when you are displaced today, the chance of going back to your home is now 20 years, which is basically doubled in the last 10 years, from 10 years average displacement periods. We see that we are increasingly operating in contexts where violence has destroyed the basic social infrastructure, health, water, sanitation systems, and have stalled education and economic development. Actors on the ground are increasingly fragmented, alliances are changing quickly, and weapons are easily available for whoever wants them to use against the adversary. In Yemen, for instance, this leads us to a situation where out of a population of 27 million, more than 22 million are in one way or the other dependent on humanitarian assistance. The consequence for humanitarian work are far-reaching of those long-term, protracted, urbanized conflicts which affect systems. As humanitarians, we can't just work short-term. We have to respond fast and slow, short-term and middle long-term. In urban settings, we have to engage with many actors to generate consensus for humanitarian work. We live in a much more protracted environment and complicated environment because there are simply more actors and war affects more systems. And then we see in particular we are operating in a highly politicized environment in which the dimensions of the problems are challenging the neutral and impartial humanitarian assistance and the approach to neutral impartial assistance, because increasingly belligerents try to manipulate the few ones who are active at the front lines in order to inform and to direct humanitarian work towards their political objectives, political interests, to the constituencies which are supporting the respective belligerents. So humanitarian work is more complicated. So first point I want to make, protracted conflicts long term is challenging us. Secondly, there is a shocking lack of respect of the basic principles of international humanitarian law when it comes to the conduct of hostilities, the way war is being waged, to the treatment of detainees, to the protection of civilians, all obligations that count for state and non-state actors today. We see inhumane treatment of detainees, a lack of protection, as I mentioned before. Fundamentally, whatever the conflict, whoever is involved, international law is the standard that must be applied so that wars have limits. But what we see is that wars increasingly do not have limits, and we find ourselves in entrenched situations and of conflict where violence is spiraling and where minimal consensus amongst belligerents is not anymore available. The whole idea of international humanitarian law is that it constitutes the minimal consensus amongst belligerents, and this minimal consensus, unfortunately, is not anymore available for us. Moreover, instead, we see that military strategies unfolding are primary targeting civilian instead of protecting civilians, and we see a logic which is developing in our conversation with belligerents, which is of concern. We see increasingly the law approached as an issue of transaction and not as an issue of compliance. This means that increasingly belligerents approach us to say, well, we know about the law, we are ready to respect it, but only if the other side also respects it, and then puts the burden on the respect and finding a consensus on us. Basically saying, we stop the bombing of civilian neighborhoods if you provide us with the guarantee that the other side stops as well. And so increasingly the law is not seen as an issue of compliance, as I said, but an issue of transaction. Also, we see increasingly arguments coming to the table, in particular in the context of fighting terrorism, which we call an argument of exceptionalism to the law, arguing that the adversary is so bad and so brutal that it is impossible to respect international humanitarian law and basic principles. And this is a new area where the Geneva Conventions and the legal frameworks applicable in the past are not anymore applicable today or in the future. Other trends are complicating our lives, and this is that many of the actors are not anymore directly involved in combat operations, but have so-called light-footed approach to warfare, indirect warfare, alliances, support of belligerents in the field, support of state and non-state actors in the field. And therefore, we are confronted with a multiplicity of actors with which we have to engage. So it's not anymore just an overseeable group of states with which we engage and which eventually make war to each other, but it is an insurmountable group of actors on the ground with which we have to engage. Mathematically, this makes humanitarian work more difficult if your task and your primary mandate is to engage with belligerents in order to respect basic norms and principles. My third point is that the conflicts and dynamics of war and violence that we are encountering are compounded by more structural risks such as income inequality, injustice, poverty, youth unemployment, violence, intercommunal violence, and criminality. In many places, violence is increasing, fueled by drug trade, unemployment, civil unrest. And so the traditional distinction between war and violence, criminal violence, societal violence, is increasingly obsolete and increasingly intermingled. In Rakhine State, for instance, in Myanmar, inter-community conflict between Muslims and Buddhist communities compound with a traditional internal armed conflict between the army and an armed group, and is complicated by structural deficiencies, poverty, exclusion, nationality issues. So all these sort of structural and different origins of violence happen in the same space and therefore challenge humanitarian work. Fourthly, we globally lack political solutions to end conflict or to mitigate their effect. Powers increasingly have difficulties, you see it, but what is maybe more disconcerting is not that big powers have difficulties finding consensus on how to solve these conflicts, but what we encounter increasingly is multi-layered difficulties and connections between the local, the national, the regional, and the global level. If you want to have access to a detention facility in Aden or Sana'a, you have to talk to actors in Tehran, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi, and eventually in Moscow, Washington, Brussels, and other places. So it's not anymore the contained local space which normally has made it easy and possible to ICRC, maybe not easy, but possible to ICRC to negotiate at front lines some of the spaces in which we could operate. Normally, frontline negotiations are compounded by political intricacies and political dynamics at national, regional, and global level, and therefore, again, we live in a slightly more difficult environment. And finally, the fourth industrial revolution is bringing challenges and solutions that we are only beginning to understand. Just to highlight one aspect of the method of warfare, innovations that yesterday were science fiction could cause catastrophe tomorrow and include combat robots, cyber attacks, and laser weapons. And in that respect, of course, we are challenged today to reflect in how far does international humanitarian law apply to those new frontiers of warfare, to a war which moves from kinetic into the cyberspace. In how far are these concepts still applicable? In how far not, and where would we have to suggest to the international community to become active and to converge to some basic rules of cyber warfare? So while there is a broad consensus that in many of the issues today that when war is connected to kinetic, even if it is digitally enhanced, that then international humanitarian law is applicable. When there is also consensus that, for instance, with regard to operations of autonomous weapons, there is that the humans should retain a role in the operation of autonomous weapons, there is still a large part of a large list of issues which need clarification, which need engagement with parties to the conflict, in particular those who have the capacities and the skills to engage and to develop weaponry and warfare into those areas. Continuing to urge greater adherence to international humanitarian law, especially the importance of refocusing on protection and changing behavior, is in this situation still a critical issue of concern to the ICRC. What we see in today's warfare, also looking at some of the behavioral sciences, is that those actors that we encounter in the battlefields that they do not necessarily work the same way the past actors have worked. In the past, we were strongly believing in hierarchy. Hierarchy would influence the behavior on the ground. Today, it's much more lateral pressure, it's community pressure, it's peer pressure, which eventually makes belligerent change. So as we move into a digital world where people are connected in a different way and separated in a different way, this changes the face of warfare and the way we look at some of the problems today. So we need to rethink our engagement also with belligerents in the light of technological development. I mentioned before, a big issue today is that in today's warfare and today's context in which we operate, that we, with the digital revolution also affecting societies, is that increasingly needs are individualized and beneficiaries of humanitarian assistance and protection articulate their concerns and their demands in a different way. The de-intermediation of every aspect of life through digital revolution changes the way humanitarians do their work. Because when you are in need in a specific situation today, be natural disaster or conflict, your possibility to get assistance and protection through connectivity is different, and therefore we have to change the way we interact with beneficiaries, because the landscape of needs around us is changing, and the possibility of connectivity between victims is changing. So not only the war and warfare and digitalization of warfare is changing the front lines of violence and conflict, but also the needs landscape is changing dramatically in the places in which we operate. When I look at some of the challenges, and this would be another important avenue to mention here as an introduction, when I see at some of the challenges with which we are confronted and the sizes of humanitarian needs with which we deal at the present moment, we feel very much that as humanitarian organization we can't do it alone. And therefore, increasingly, we look for how we partner with others in order to respond more meaningfully to the needs landscape with which we are confronted. Multi-sector partnership, pooling expertise and resources to make humanitarian work more effective, impactful, and innovative is therefore an important imperative of the way we are looking at today's conflict and the gap between the needs and our capacity to respond. In our partnership with the private sector, for instance, we started moving away from a simple donor-recipient relationship some time ago, and today we have an increasing number of partnerships to bring together the skills and interests of humanitarian organizations and the business community to solve difficult problems. Just a couple of days ago, I signed a cooperation agreement between ICRC, the Danish Red Cross, and one of the largest pharmaceutical companies, Novo Nordisk, specialized in non-communicable diseases, in particular in insulin for diabetes patients. Why do we do this kind of partnership? Because we recognize that in the context and conflicts which I have described to you, you don't have as a primary concern anymore the war wounded. Our primary concern increasingly are the lateral effect and the indirect effect of wars on societies, and this leads to deficiencies in health systems over the long term, and therefore in the midst of the battlefields where people are wounded still, as we see it on television, we see that the structural deficiencies of the health system are increasingly pressing on humanitarian actors, and we have to respond and to deal with an increasing amount of patients with communicable and non-communicable diseases, an issue which we haven't been able to deal with in the past. We have no expertise. We have no knowledge about non-communicable diseases. We need to enter into new forms of partnerships which allow us to respond in a more meaningful way. We also partner to test innovative funding streams, including instruments with market elements or market-based elements into humanitarian assistance. We have last year, for instance, issued for the first time a humanitarian impact bond to create new capital stream to fund our work for physical rehabilitation centers and to create physical rehabilitation centers in the midst of the most fragile war and violence context in which we operate. This is based on a pay-for-result model and involves private funders as well as governments. In some way, the humanitarian impact bond is a radical step for the ICRC because it moves from a traditional economic model where we take money and transform it into humanitarian services to a pay-for-performance model where you invest money into a problem and you ensure capital return to the funder, and you hope to create a funding stream which multiplies the surface of activities that we are hoping to cover. Digital connectivity too is allowing us to design more impactful solutions based on people's self-identified needs and for more efficient coordination between services. Today we use already big data analysis to target humanitarian assistance to places where we identify needs emerging, and we are much faster with big data analysis. But here again, we don't know how big data analysis works as traditional humanitarian actors. So we need to learn, we need to partner, we need to enhance by working together with others the surface of operation, given the disruptive force of today's violence and conflict. And finally, being at Wilson Center, I wanted to mention that it is not all about partnership and technology. It's also about our own capacities and build-up of capacities to negotiate humanitarian spaces. 2 years ago, we created a Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation in Geneva, where we try as a multi-agency effort between UNHCR, the High Commissioner on Refugees, the World Food Programme, Humanitarian Dialogue, Doctors Without Borders, and ICRC as a joint venture to learn from each other and to improve our methodologies, skills, and capacities to negotiate at frontline in an increasingly complex environment, humanitarian spaces in which services can be delivered in a better and more targeted way. So I concluded here with my couple of introductory work here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Peter. You said it was not a keynote address, but it was comprehensive and succinct and really opened the door to a host of issues that we can pursue during the discussion period. You had such a kind of logical kind of outline of your remarks. Let me just, to initiate the conversation, ask some questions that really parallel the structure of your talk. You mentioned the protracted nature of armed conflict, and that your organization prides itself on responding to emergencies quickly, but you also find yourself like staying decades in certain areas. How has that trend of protracted conflict, how has that changed how your organization organizes itself, and even as it prepares to respond to humanitarian needs that arise sort of through a natural disaster or whatever?
Well, it definitely forces us to be more than one organization. On the one side, you continue to have emergency operations which need fast and quick decision-making, chains of command, delivery of logistical pipelines. This is all what we have done for 150 years, built up in particular over the last 30 years, and I to be enhanced, improved, made more efficiently, but it is one tier only of work that we are going to do. And then at the same time, and I have briefly alluded to, you need to have another modus operandi within your own organization, which thinks about more strategically. And it starts that donors don't accept anymore the idea of paying every year for the same emergency. So when you are confronted with the fact that your donor base doesn't accept anymore the idea for the 30th row in a year to pay $100 million to mitigate the effect of war in the Congo or in Afghanistan, you have to think how with your humanitarian work you contribute to more than just relieving the emergency. So you have to think to take a more long-term vision. And this demands other skills and capacities from your staff, and it demands other capabilities also of the organization to manage. And so at the present moment, I think we are really in this transformatory process where we have almost ICRC has almost become a holding of two organizations in which we develop a skill set which we haven't had in the past, and we continue to nurture the best of what we have done in the past.
You mentioned, one trend, protracted conflict, and also another, which is that conflicts are increasingly being fought in urban areas. You touched on increased frequency in the Middle East in particular, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Gaza. We saw the battle for Mosul, where ISIS fighters were kind of really embedded in the urban area. Can you talk about that trend and how your organization is adapting the humanitarian responses to this trend, but also what can be done to urge militaries to undertake policies to better protect civilians during urban battles?
Well, first it seems to me when we look at the impact of warfare and the spiking numbers of victims, it's obvious that urban warfare is producing a different kind of victims, and it's much more difficult to implement the basic principles of international law. Distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the midst of an environment where the fighters and the civilian live in the same building, eventually on different floors, becomes kind of elusive and extremely difficult. And I think it is this intermingling of civilians and militaries which increasingly make warfare difficult in compliance with international humanitarian law and principles of distinction, proportionality. The second we see is not only that people, civilians in particular, are affected, they become increasingly the main target because they suffer from direct attack and they suffer from the systemic attack, while military groups and armies have an ability to organize their logistics. Civilians don't have anything if public services fall apart. And so what we see, for instance, in the conflicts, when you look at the typical pattern of the Middle Eastern conflict and the urban battlefields, is that the fighters always have their supply chain in medicine, in food, in water, in everything. The civilians haven't, because they are civilians. Once the system is bombed and knocked out, you don't have a replacement. And therefore, civilians are much more affected by the situations. And so we are in complicated discussions with most of the belligerents in those contexts. And at the end of the day, of course, ideally, you would drastically limit the use of explosives in densely populated areas with the impact that we are witnessing. But actually, in terms of military strategy, is exactly the opposite that is happening. Wars become increasingly totalitarian and all-encompassing. And I think it is this discrepancy which challenges us so much. I always wonder, if you have a choice today, the securest place is to be part of an armed group or of an army. The insecurest place is when you are a civilian in an urban context. Then you are triple punished. And I think we haven't found a credible way out. I think early warning is something which can be done, but then the militaries normally tell you early warning is basically revealing our military strategy and makes us vulnerable. When we tell the civilian population that tomorrow we are bombing, then the adversary jumps away, the civilians stay, and again the logic turns against the civilians. So it's a very complicated environment in which we operate, and but at the end of the day, the engagement with the different groups and groupings is the only perspective which promises some improvements. And I was mentioning trying to influence belligerents, and I think what we see is that religious leaders, communities have a bigger influence that we normally suggest on the behavior of belligerents. It was very interesting for us, for instance, to recognize in Raqqa under Islamic State control, or in Hasakeh under Islamic State control, there was more civilian contestation against the fighters than would have appeared in the news of each and every day. And so fighters cannot just fight their wars without some consideration over time. And I think these are some of the approaches we are trying also to convince those belligerents in urban context in particular to give sense to the principles of precaution and proportionality, and to have much more consideration for the fate of civilians. With structured armies, of course, we certainly encourage them to factor into their targeting, non-hit list considerations on the impact of civilians. And one of the big debates here again we have is that militaries tend just to look at the direct impact, but humanitarians tend to look at the systemic impact of an attack. And of course that's the difficulty in the conversation to find a way forward.
The ICRC is considered the custodian of the Geneva Conventions, and your organization does a lot of work around the world to promote these rules of armed conflict, and yet we see those principles being flouted in different conflict areas. So what are some practical steps that policymakers and government could take, those that care about kind of rule of law in the area of conflict? What can be done to promote compliance with these norms?
Well, there are different things, but one aspect we have increasingly, which I would like to highlight here, and which we have increasingly started to think about, is that we have maybe overemphasized in the public debate on wars and conflict and their impact the aspect of violations, and we have zoomed out those cases where the law is respected. And when we look closer to the realities with which we are confronted, we see a lot of examples where the law is respected, because it's not a conventional law, it's customary law at the end of the day. It's enshrined in societies and cultures around the globe. And it has to be resuscitated and re-energized and be carried forward by communities. But it is interesting, and so we have launched this project at ICRC with a couple of research institutions to look at positive examples of implementation of the law and how we build on those positive examples and how we can emulate those positive examples and create a culture of respect and not only emphasize violations and accountability. Again, I'm not against looking at violations and strengthening accountability structures. It may also be our flawed perspective of looking at some of the conflicts today which have zoomed out the positive aspects which unquestionably exist. Again, it's, for instance, interesting for us. I mean, with whom do we work? We may have overemphasized also our engagement with armed group instead of looking to strengthen communities, also to help themselves and to defend and to ask for the implementation of their rights. A study that we have done last year has shown that in situations of conflict, people know very well what international humanitarian law demands, and they develop strategies of engagement with belligerents which are pretty effective. When the community leaders, the religious leaders, the fathers and mothers tell to the sons to behave in a certain way, that makes a difference and can make a difference and can change the ball game. So it's not, and I think energizing those forces is important and has changed the way we interact with the broader community. It's not only the army general and relying on its chain of command to the soldier, but it's also looking at the community and trying to strengthen the knowledge, the consciousness about the law. By the way, it's funny, as I'm sitting here, a Swiss with an American, this study has been done in 16 countries. We wanted to know what people knew about international humanitarian law. And those two countries doing worse about the knowledge of international humanitarian law were Switzerland and the United States. While the Syrians know IHL very much.
Who says there's no irony in Washington?
Yeah.
Yes, so the United States, some of my fellow citizens are still trying to work out Austria and Australia. It doesn't surprise me, but Switzerland does surprise me since you're such an international city. You mentioned who you're working with, and that really raises the it's an old question, but in a new context, the use of proxies. You know, some states are relying on proxies, and that raises compliance issues with rules of law where a party will use a non-state actor acting on its behalf. You know, what challenges does that pose to the ICRC, and what recommendations do you have to states who have employed proxies? I mean, the United States, with ISIS, we were using Iraqi Kurds and other groups that are not safe. So what about that theme?
Well, I mean, what I can say very clearly is that the formula that you basically shovel warfare to the proxy and think that you don't have anything anymore to do with what those proxies do is not working. Because it haunts you and it backfires on you, because at the end of the day, those proxies and states and groups only are able to operate because of the military, logistical, intelligence support of very advanced armies and economies. And in terms of recommendations, I think this forces us to rethink what roles and responsibilities actors have who engage into partnership, alliance warfare and support of state and non-state armed groups. And I think we are in new territory in which we try to discuss those issues with key states. You may have seen just a couple of days ago the communique of the G7 foreign minister coming forward, also mentioning the responsibility of the G7 to look at the behavior of their partners. It's a little bit a similar phenomenon that the business world has known when consumers started to look at supply chain. You don't fully control your supply chain and you don't fully control your delivery chain. But you have a responsibility towards the supply chain and the delivery chain with regard to vetting partners. If you deliver weapons, you better look whether they are able to use those weapons according to the law. So you have to do trainings. If you deliver a weapon, you have to have some assurances that these weapons are used in conformity with international humanitarian law. So in terms of training, vetting, engaging, leveraging influence, I think there is a lot still to do, and I think we are very much thinking with some of those countries on how to develop again best practices, things which work, things which have an impact. But we are in the midst of a discussion today, which the last word hasn't been spoken yet.
Your organization, in a sense, is providing a response to the demand for your services, whether it's an immediate crisis or a protracted kind of engagement as you've had. So let's talk about the supply side, like what's creating this demand for your services. One aspect of it is the issue of fragile states and states with low capacity, that if development strategies can be effectively implemented, those strategies may mitigate the forces that will eventually generate the demand. That's one aspect of it, kind of the development piece. The other aspect of it is on the diplomatic side of what political processes can be undertaken to resolve conflicts, to end your protracted involvement in some of these areas. So talk about the supply side.
Well, it's a delicate issue for a humanitarian who supposedly is not to talk about political issues, but has its space of neutral and impartial. And it's an issue which has preoccupied the ICRC as modern humanitarian actor for quite some time. How far do you go in your engagement in advocating for a political concept which is mediation and peace, but which is basically not ruled by neutral and impartial humanitarian action? And I think we are trying to navigate that way, and a lot is case-to-case decisions that we take. But it is obvious that in today's world, even demonstrating the cost of conflict and trying to engage actors to factor this cost of conflict in their calculation is important, because what we see is a clear underinvestment on diplomacy and mediation, and an overinvestment on the illusions of fighting wars and winning wars against low costs. And what we basically tell to belligerents and to those supporting belligerents today is, if you factor in the costs, you should have much more political diplomatic engagement to find frameworks and agreements. And the walkaway point would be a different one. I mean, look at Syria. I mean, if all the actors around Syria would have known 7 years ago how Syria looks, after 7 years of limitless conflict, they may have made their calculation differently. The problem is that the one thought that the president is away in 2 weeks and therefore things will be solved.
Yeah, that was the same comment made about 1914 in the Great Powers. If they knew where they were going to end up in 1918, 19,
Yeah.
they wouldn't have started the war. Yeah.
No, that's right. I mean, it's a delicate issue. What strikes me in the history of the ICRC is that for quite some time, at the beginning of the organization, when the organization was founded, and for the founding fathers, there was never a discrepancy and never a conflict between the engagement for short-term relief and the engagement for peace.
Right.
The founders of the Red Cross have been peace advocates. It's not by chance that they got the Peace Nobel Prize. They wanted peace, and they thought they had, through humanitarian work was a building block for peace, and they were cognizant that beyond humanitarian work, something else were badly needed. And I think for a long time, in the last couple of decades, we have a little bit forgotten about this role as advocates for peace, given the enormous impact of modern warfare. And I think that's where we are at the present moment. We have some spectacular examples where in the history of ICRC, the organization decided to work on the concept of neutral intermediary, which is contained in the Geneva Conventions, much more broader than as a neutral intermediary to provide assistance amongst a divided landscape of belligerents. They thought the ICRC made proposals to sit together to provide a space for political negotiations, to provide safe spaces for people so that first step towards peace could be found. So it's a delicate issue because once you move into that territory, you also expose yourself to the accusation that you are taking side, because peace is always a non-consensual issue and an issue also ruled by power politics. And so it's typically the dilemma in which humanitarian organizations are. We are committed to neutral and impartial work. That's our methodology. We know that it is not enough. We have to do advocacy. We may have to facilitate so that belligerents can meet and engage, but we can't substitute ourselves to the political engagement which is needed by political actors for political solutions.
My last question before turning over to the audience for theirs, it focuses on the fourth industrial revolution as bringing challenges, and we're only beginning to understand what possible solutions there may be to them. You mentioned cyber attacks, autonomous weapons, the wedding of technology with artificial intelligence, creating new platforms for militaries, drones and the like that don't involve manned aircraft or even autonomous machines, essentially. Talk about, flesh out your thinking on that issue. How can the rules of law be adapted for these new technologies? How should we begin to think about it? And are governments engaging on this issue already?
Well, there is a more technical and a more political response to your question. I mean, the more technical response is that an organization responsible for the legal framework of warfare, we are doing a lot of background work on trying to explore and give meaning to the basic concept of international humanitarian law given the technological development. And we are feeding and engaging with states in order to see where consensus is about the interpretation of the basic concept, about gaps and how to close gaps. That's kind of a technical process underway with those high contracting parties who have a capacity and an ability and an interest to engage on those issues. Are they doing enough, and is there enough of an interest to engage on those issues? That's one of the critical disarmament dilemma which we are always confronted with. Those who are ahead of the curve don't have a particular appetite to rule-based development of the international order. And those who are running behind are those who don't have the power to impose rule-based order. And so we have this discrepancy which we are continuously managing in weapons technology and weapons development, that eventually at a certain moment we would have to have a recognition that the arms race towards digital is eventually devastating for all, and that therefore more consensual and rule-based development and what the ground rules of war and violence in the cyberspace is could eventually develop. But at the present moment, I think we still have very much a split international community between those who still believe that the development of their tools and weapons, digitalized weaponry, is bringing them advantage in the future. I think what is eventually changing, and we have seen that emerging in our conversations with some of the tech companies, is that some of the technological companies are important actors to the development and the understanding of the future of warfare. And what we see today is that technological companies have an increased interest because they look at consumers and markets, and they have an increased interest to gain the trust of people. And the trust of people today doesn't come by forcing the development of digitalized war technologies. So I think we are really at the beginning of eventually a normative development, and we are very far away from consensus. We are very far away from equal engagement on those issues, but we are certainly interested to engage with companies as well as with states in order to demonstrate the negative humanitarian impact that some of those first signs of cyber warfare have. I mean, we have seen hospital infrastructures knocked out in semi-belligerent approaches, and these are worrying signs of what future warfare could mean.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions from the floor. If speakers would please identify themselves.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. With much of the bloodshed, increasingly the bloodshed, being conducted by those who claim they're working on behalf of Islam, and those same folks being more likely than most to break the rules of war, is the Red Crescent being given any sort of pass in its work, or are they being perceived as an agent of the West along with the rest of the Red Cross?
Well, the context of warfare in the Islamic world is, of course, it's a particular challenge. We, by the way, 70% of our activities are in Islamic countries because that's the places where a lot of warfare is happening at the present moment. We don't have a very clear pattern to say that violations of international humanitarian law are linked to Islam or Islamic societies and Islamic law. You see violations in all societies happening. It's just you have more conflicts at the present moment in the Islamic world in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. With regard to the Red Cross activity in Islamic context, the issue of cross and crescent is heavily overrated. Most of the time, it's a non-issue. People know who we are and what we do, and the national societies, which are often Red Crescent Society and ICRC, which has a Red Cross as an emblem, are working together to respond to needs of people. And so you may have situations, and we may have had situations in the past where the cross was seen as not acceptable by some of the more extremist organizations, but it is not a pattern which preoccupies us overly.
Do the jihadists
No.
kill red
No,
crescent?
no.
Yes, they do kill. I mean, it's not dependent on whether you are a crescent or a cross. Their attitude when we negotiate spaces for humanitarian activities, sometimes their attitude towards the Red Cross may be reserved, or we may have reluctance to display and to use our emblem. But it's not a pattern which, interestingly enough, is preoccupying us enormously. It's the cross and the crescents are affected. Humanitarian workers of the UN are affected by attacks on them. It's the lack of consensual humanitarian space. The fact that sometimes we don't see some of those actors on our landscape, which makes the situation so dangerous today.
Yes. Question in the back.
Jean Smith, Smith Brandon, here in Washington, D.C. From a very practical point of view, and as a donor, what do you say in response to the fact that some of the money that is going for humanitarian aid is essentially diverted for terrorist or insurgent activities? And so any money that's being donated to ICRC or other similar organizations, it is not really going to the people that we think we're donating to.
Well, it's of course a very serious issue, which is a top risk for an organization, and on which we invest a lot to prevent misuse and fraud and deviation of money. What I can tell you with regard to ICRC and the Red Cross is that we do control our operations our own. We don't license operations to others, and therefore we have probably a stricter control than some of the other systems and aid systems have. I think I have no guarantee that some of the misuse is not taking place, but with the controls we have, I think we are pretty sure that the deviations and misuses of money are in very low percentages of all the contributions we get. We are pretty sure that we have good control and that we identify misuse and that we act immediately. We have, as with other issues, a zero tolerance policy on misuse of funds, on diversions of funds, on corruption of own workers, on active corruptions of others. So there is a strict code of conduct imposed, controlled, monitored, which allows us, I think, to give reasonable assurances to donors that diversions and misuses are minimal.
That gentleman there, and then this gentleman.
Thank you very much. Your distinguished speech, and in the future's warfare's comprehensive analysis, very helpful.
Could you
for me.
identify yourself,
Yeah,
please?
I am from Korea National Defense University. Yeah, my question is, cyber warfare and space warfare cases. It is difficult to define diligent issue, or diligent definition is very difficult. Therefore, now this international society, they controversially discuss about a code of conduct or Tallinn manual. We said to this is not international agreement, but code of conduct. What do you think about these soft law, or in the future? So what do you think about this?
Kind of a tacit
Yeah, yeah.
code versus,
Yeah.
de jure.
Well, I think given that formal legal development processes at the present moment are particularly difficult to entertain, and within formal processes and structures it seems to be extremely difficult to come to consensus, I think combinations of more soft law approaches, informal processes, expert definitions, professional circles trying to put up standards and practices are of critical importance. I think we often focus too much on just law development within formal structures, and we underestimate and underprivilege the enormous importance of having professional standards, soft law, developed in areas which over time will generate eventually more substantive legal frameworks. But I think a text like the Tallinn Manual are extremely welcome contributions to the reflection of it's not yet a globally consensual manual, but it is an important contribution which helps us think.
Gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Greg Schuckman. I'm with the University of Central Florida. UCF is a public research university located in Orlando. We have 66,000 students, so we're one of the largest universities in the United States and I suppose in the world. My question to you is, because higher education is so disparate, do we have a role, or what role do you see for us in terms of the academic and cultural exchange that will service the humanitarian relief activities that organizations like yours support?
Well, from our side as the ICRC, we have over the decades focused a lot on partnerships with universities, not only for education and training and research, and but also for development and developing strategies. So in our networks of either clarifying the law, applying the law, having social sciences, allowing us to read the environment and the landscape in which we are operating, using science networks as precursors also of law and policy development is very much part of what we do. So we are at the same time, I mentioned partnership, I could have developed quite a lot of partner and relationship that we entertain with the academic world, and very happy if we hear that such a large university has an interest in the areas of our focus.
Gentleman there.
Thank you. I'm Phil Schrafer, retired international healthcare worker. President Maurer, I'm very affected always by the last magazine article I read, and it happened to be an article in the New Yorker by Osnos comparing the United States and China. The United States is pulling out of science, pulling out of the Paris Peace, the climate accords, pulling out of international development, very modest artificial intelligence investments. On the other hand, China is getting much more involved in the United Nations, building infrastructure around the world. So the question for me is when are you going to be going to Beijing? I think you're maybe wasting your time here in Washington, D.C.
Well, I'm expected in Beijing in 3 weeks' time. So, and
But his largest donor is still here. So
Yeah.
He's here. There's a gentleman right behind.
Henry Hetker, retired government. You mentioned climate change early in your speech, and I wondered, is there anything on the drawing boards regarding the growing problem? For instance, Switzerland, giant lakes are forming that weren't there before due to the melting of glaciers. The islands in the Pacific are slowly going underwater at high tide. Miami's being inundated a bit. What are on the drawing boards that might help humanity?
well, what is on the drawing board, and we are immediately sort of seeing it on the ground in some of the conflicts in which we operate, is that climate change changes the pattern of agriculture and grassland and rural economies all over Africa, and it's definitely an important factor in many of the conflicts through the Sahel to the Horn of Africa. So we see in many places of the world in which we are and the conflicts with which we deal, we see climate change, environmental degradation, resource scarcity as an important driver of conflict. It's not the only one. It has different importance and relevance depending from one context to the other, but it is uncontestable for us that we are increasingly confronted with situation in which the impact of climate change and environmental degradation is a critical issue on the conflict fracture lines with which we are operating. If you look, for instance, I've been at the beginning of the year in Central African Republic where the line between pastoralists and agriculturalists is moving fast because of climate change, and because pastoralists and agriculturalists are respectively Islamic societies and animist Christian societies, you have at the same time a compounding of the problems of religious, culture, ethnicity, and environment. And we increasingly see these conundrums of factors coming together, which again, of course, then force us as humanitarians to find different ways of responding. What do you say to an agriculturalist who loses his productive land? What is humanitarian work you can do? What are alternative schemes of income that you may be able to generate? And what are the medium and long-term consequences you have to factor in when doing humanitarian work? But it's an obvious and incontestable factor which comes into one complication more on some of the dynamics we're dealing with.
We'll take I'm afraid we have just time for two more questions. We'll take the two on the side here. The first woman.
Hi. My name is Danielle Wollenberg, and I work for the American Red Cross. So I just had a question, because you mentioned that over 65 million people are currently displaced around the world, and that connectivity is becoming an increasing need. I'm just curious about what you foresee as the future of the Restoring Family Links program.
Well, we hope, of course, that the connectivity is one of the features of technology which will help us also to find a new quality of response to some of the humanitarian issues that we have been dealing with. And family response and family connectivity and family reunion is, of course, one of the first and foremost where digitally enhanced platforms, hopefully allow us in the future to connect people in a much more meaningful way. You know that we are investing together with national societies and the Federation quite a lot in enhancing our databases and making the already largest database which is existing much more available to people. And I think it's just one of those obvious no-brainer programs which illustrates that digital enhancement of a response can qualitatively change the response, because it changes the way people have access to their data and are able to exchange those data. And I think that's an enormous potential. But let me just also say it doesn't stop there. I think in that sense, family reunification programs and digitally enhanced family reunification programs will at the same time also be a precursor how we deal with personal data, which today are so critical for the identity and personality of people. And what we learn in terms of data protection, being a secure host of sensitive data and information is something which is of critical importance. And I think the family program is kind of almost a pilot project into a world where we hopefully are seen as a trustful depository of important data for vulnerable people.
Final question.
Hello, Janet Bonini, George Washington University, and wife of a former ICRC delegate. My question has to do with the several times that you mentioned non-state actors, both in terms of adversaries, but also in terms of participants in humanitarian issues, like companies that are taking socially responsible positions, professional associations that are developing codes of conduct, and of course, organizations like the ICRC. Right now, where it seems like many nations are kind of locked up in their interactions and in their policies, is this an opportunity for more non-state actors to become involved, and how can organizations like yours promote that?
Well, as I briefly mentioned, I mean, we have a lot of partners in society, local NGOs, national NGOs in context in which we operate. We partner with global institutions who are delivering complementary work, and I think the more inclusive responses with whoever is able and willing to participate in finding a more meaningful response to the problems is what we need at the present moment. As you can imagine, there is always a delicate issue on how much you move together and where you are, and you have a distinct role and responsibility. And my vision is that, of course, in humanitarian response, we need both. We need cooperation, inclusion, but we also need distinction and complementarity. We shouldn't do all the same things. And I'm working hard to find the best line for an organization like ICRC to remain what has made us strong and which is specific to ICRC, and at the same time define those areas where cooperation gives value added because it allows us to more meaningfully respond to problems. I make normally a quite clear distinction between non-state armed groups and NGOs and business and academia, which are partners in a meaningful response. Having said that, non-state armed groups are important stakeholders of conflicts today, and we need to engage with them in order to nudge them into behavior according to the law. And that's what we normally do.
Thank you. In addition to thanking you for your remarks, I want to thank your tremendous staff for all the help in putting today's meeting together. They're really outstanding, help in mounting this effort, as well as my own colleagues, Maria Stella Gatzulis and Casey Breidenbach, who worked on this event. We're grateful for those all who made today possible. We can continue this conversation down in the Memorial Hall. There's a reception there. I want to thank you all today for joining us. Please join me in thanking President Maurer for his excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.